you're trying to put yourself back into slavery.
The law of God is never said to be slavery. Okay.
Is that what it does is it slowly and insidiously draws your focus off of Christ and his work and points it back to Moses.
We reject Judaizing. We enter the covenant by faith, and we stay in because of the completed work of Christ.
In a sense, the law is still very valid today to point out our sin. It's one of the things it does for us.
He says, but we still have a moral code. Well, what is it? What is the moral code then? If it's not the law of God, what is it?
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Bible Uncut, the show all about being shaped not simply by Scripture alone, but by all of Scripture. Today, we have a very special episode for you today, outside our regular season, because I have a special guest with me today, coming to talk about a topic we've been planning and wanting to talk about this for a little while now, but we've been able to find some time where our schedules align and able to come together and talk about this topic today. So today I am joined by the pastor of Logos Church in Chatsworth, Georgia, the author of a pocket guide to the doctrine of the Trinity, husband, father, and a dear brother in the Lord, Josh Ensley. Welcome to the Bible Uncut.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. Good to have you. So Josh, just before we really get into anything, just for anyone who's not familiar with you, doesn't know you, just introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us about your involvement in ministry. What do you do, and what's your passion, and what are your goals in ministry? And give us a personal fun fact.
Okay, yeah. So I'm about 35 years old. I graduated from Shorter University, summa cum laude of my class in 2014, so December of that year. So I'm coming up on 11 or 12 years since graduation. I graduated my bachelor's degree from the School of Divinity down there, and I've been an online Bible teacher since my time in university, a couple years before. And so I would teach locally, but I'd also do like Zoom, or not Zoom, it was before Zoom. That was when we were doing Skype back then. It was before Discord and Zoom and all that. And so I've been a Bible teacher for quite a long time, and honestly, the earliest years were not the best, and I've kind of taken down most of those videos because I just realized I was too young to go ahead and be acting as any sort of authority back then, and a Bible teacher. But that develops as you get older. You get more wise, and you look back on stuff, and you're like, man, that was kind of cringe. But since then, it's been a while. Since then, I've launched what's called the Pronomian Christianity movement. It's kind of one of my brainchilds years ago, alongside Pronomian Publishing, and just a lot that goes into that distinct movement that I'm trying to carve out with this term pronomian, taking inspiration from Dr. Greg Bonson in using it. And so I'm really trying to unite people through a quick statement of faith called the First Pronomian Statement, and help plant churches, build community online, but also build community in person locally for people. And one of the ways I do that is a couple years ago, I launched Logos Church of Chatsworth, which is what you mentioned earlier, up here in North Georgia in the mountains. And I serve as pastor of Logos, and we have, as of last month, been meeting for 2 years. So we've gone through 2 festival cycles, over 100 Sabbaths at this point. And it's been great. We're a small little church. We're a Reformed Pronomian church, so we have our own specific tradition that we are carving out, and it's working, it's growing, and I'm just really glad that things are panning out as they are. And I'm gracious to God that I now have a church for my family to be raised in and discipled in, and for other people to have their families discipled in. So my passions, though, because of that, pastoral ministry is my greatest passion. I really think it's paramount that we have local churches. I think that the New Testament just assumes local churches, and that's how people are going to be discipled. And so online communities are wonderful. You and I are on the same kind of online community. That's how we're talking to each other right now across the world. But local churches are where we've got to put some focus. So pastoral ministry is my prime focus. Training up men to be men. I think that the church has become so weaponized against men and masculinity in the last few decades, and I'm trying to steer that back on course. So I'm training up the men to remember how to be men and to be fathers and husbands and brothers and leaders of the church. I teach a love for the Psalms, so I love the Psalter. I think that God gave us 150 perfect songs for us to sing and pray in church, and so Logos Church, we sing the Psalms every week. I'm preaching through the Psalms right now through book 1, so the first 41 Psalms. I'm on Psalm 10 as of this week, and it's just been wonderful. It really helps the church to modify their prayers. I've seen such a difference in the last year where I've leaned into the Psalters, or into the Psalter, and I see the prayers of the people of the church being shaped by that. And it's really great to hear biblical prayers and biblical songs and stuff like that. So I'm all about that. And I like to write books. I've written a few books now, and I'm working on my my magnus opus right now. It's called Pronomianism, Stated and Defended. So I'm going to state the doctrine of pronomianism, and then I'm going to defend it against any and all objections that I've heard throughout the years or what I'm hearing now. And hopefully that be a good resource for people who are considering this view, but there's not like an exhaustive work stating and defending this particular theological view. And so that's my next goal this year, to finish that up. I hope I can finish it up, because I am a high school teacher, I'm a dad, and I'm a husband, and I like to hunt and fish some in my off time. I don't have much of it, but and I pastor a church, so I don't have much time, but I'm going to try to finish that by the end of this year. And one personal fun fact to end all that is I am a former Twitch streamer. I was making a good amount of money streaming on Twitch, playing Minecraft and World of Warcraft and stuff like that. Old school Pokemon games. I don't do it anymore. I play Minecraft a little bit on our Pronomian Minecraft server called the Kosher Dome. If you want to join and you're listening to this, just holler at me. But yeah, that's about me, man. Oh yeah, and I've been married to my wonderful, beautiful, passionate, and loving and caring wife, Krista, of about 8 years now. And I have 3 children, 1 son who's 2 years old here at home, and 2 in the arms of the Lord.
Yeah. Awesome. Wow. Twitch streamer. Exciting. Yes, you Twitch streamer. Was it David was in a Christian metal band?
Well, I was too. Me and David actually have the same kind of musical background. You can see my Stratocaster back there behind me. But
there we go.
I was big into the metal scene. I've played with some big bands, opened for some big bands in the metal scene back in the early 2000s. Cool. So yeah, it's I don't know. People are like, "You've done all that stuff." It's like, yeah, but man, I didn't get to sleep a lot because I've done a lot of stuff.
No. Yeah, no, I was big into music, but I had no musical talent. I don't know, it feels like a bit of a curse. Hey, you will enjoy this thing, but you'll be no good at it. So. All right, so for today we are responding to author and scholar RL Solberg, no connection to me, and we're looking at his interview on Cultish. And Cultish is an amazing podcast. If you haven't listened to it or checked it out yet, I strongly recommend it. They're an amazing resource, especially when it comes to sort of understanding the cults, how to reach out and witness to them. They're amazing show, and I love so much of their work. But today we're looking at RL Solberg and his interview with him in his discussion about the Hebrew Roots movement. We also want to talk about his definition of Torahism. This is something that Josh has written about. But we'll sort of get into that a little bit later. But before we do get into our videos and our responding, if this is your first time listening or first time watching, just let you know straight up where we're coming from, because if you've seen my latest book, By These Alone, the Bible study on the 5 solas of the Reformation, haven't got it up. This one there.
There it is.
We fully affirm the 5 solas, as well as many other core doctrines of Protestant and Reformed theology. But we, as Josh has mentioned, we go by the label Pronomian. But yeah, Josh, could you maybe explain the difference between Pronomianism and Hebrew Roots? People are probably more familiar with Hebrew Roots, a little bit more common, but Pronomianism, what's that? Josh, would you be able to just explain Pronomianism and what sets it apart from Hebrew Roots? What makes us different?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that a lot of people conflate the two, and that's one of the reasons we're talking about this today, is because I think there's a conflation from RL Solberg on these two ideas. So Pronomianism, first, it's a term that I'm wearing out online. I think it's a wonderful, brilliant term, and it just means pro-law. So it's the antithesis of antinomian, so it's pronomian. It means pro-God's law, and I believe that Pronomianism is an orthodox position. I think it is the continuation of the work of the reformers and guys in the 20th century like Rushdoony and Bonson, who are saying, hey, we cannot cast aside the law of God, like the Catholic Church was doing in the Reformation. Because one of Martin Luther's big qualms during the Reformation was the antinomianism of the Catholic Church. They thought that you could just buy penance, you could just buy indulgences and time out of stuff like that. So we're trying to continue the work of the Reformers. And so Pronomians are Christians who affirm the Trinity, the deity of Christ, salvation by grace through faith, the 5 solas of the Reformation, that we are members of the New Covenant, and essentially we just see that God's law in totality is still morally binding on every Christian and every person in the world, and we aim to honor God's commandments while staying connected to historic Christianity. We're not restorationist. We believe that we are Christians. We believe that we are Orthodox Christians. I personally believe that Pronomianism is necessarily reformed because it stands upon the doctrine of sola scriptura. It's the logical conclusion to the Reformation. And so we're just trying to continue the work of the Reformers that direction. Now, contrast that with Hebrew roots. Hebrew roots is, like Soulberg mentions in the video, it's not monolithic. It's really hard to nail down what Hebrew roots actually means because there's no overarching standard, there's no overarching definition or leader of the Hebrew roots movement. And so within the Hebrew roots movement, you'll see splinter groups. It's kind of fractional, it's factional, and a lot of groups deny core Christian doctrines like the Trinity. They reject parts of the New Testament. They bring in other books into the Old Testament canon or even New Testament canon. And a lot of them actually maintain the view that the Christian must maintain their justification by obedience to God's law. And that is completely contrary to the doctrines of the Reformation, sola fide, sola gratia. And many of them treat Christianity as paganized or corrupt. That's not us. That's Hebrew roots. And again, it's really hard to nail down what Hebrew roots really is, but those are just some really common things you see within people in groups who claim to be Hebrew roots. And so we are distinguished. One of the reasons I carved out the term pronomian in the first pronomian statement was to distinguish us from Hebrew roots, because we're not Hebrew roots. I don't believe we are a cult. I don't believe that we are heretical. And so that there is a difference, and we shouldn't be lumped in together with them just because we have a similar view to the importance of God's law. Which honestly, it's not even that much difference of a degree if you poll just the regular Protestant Christian. We just have a few other areas of God's law that we think, yes, these are still morally binding. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, exactly right. That's really helpful. That's really clear. And I think it is important that we sort of recognize the distinction because Hebrew roots they throw a lot more extra stuff into their doctrine, their theology, if you will. A lot of extra biblical stuff. So so that being the case, since we're not Hebrew roots and the episode of Cultish was about the Hebrew roots, why bother responding? And also I know for me there's with Solberg there's a bit of content that he does, and I think he does well. And one thing that I think I have in common with him, and Josh, maybe you agree as well, I love and I share his concern for the purity of the gospel. I mean, we disagree on maybe how to go about it, but we both agree the gospel needs to be protected and preserved as the once for all faith passed down from the apostles, as Jude describes it. And look, in the also in the interview, there's a bunch of points that he makes that I think they're helpful. I think they're great, and I think they offer really good insight to us.
But, I agree. I think there's a lot in common with guys like Soulberg and us, and I don't know exactly where he stands on the Reformed side of things, but I don't think that Soulberg is unorthodox. I've been given nothing to think that he's unorthodox. I think that we just disagree on a practical matter, which is where do we draw the line around the definition of sin and what God expects the Christian life and piety to be like in conformance with God's law.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, so so we just want to go in setting that loud and clear. This is not about him. It's not about totally tearing him down. It's just, hey, we disagree on this area. And as we get in, you'll see why, as Pronomians, we feel we need to engage with this topic as well, because it's the topic of Torahism that we want to discuss. Because truth and accuracy, I'm sure Solberg will agree. Josh, I'm sure you agree. They're important. If you want a good theology, you need to be truthful, you need to be accurate. But we feel, and I don't want to sort of lay any blame or say it was intentional, but I kind of feel, and Josh, you probably feel as well, Solberg has misrepresented Pronomianism. and we want, I guess, the chance to respond to that and clarify some of those differences. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Josh? Sort of our why, our motives, I guess.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Really, my motivation here is, and in responding to Solberg's work and written work and stuff like that, is just to really make sure that he and those who hear him understand that this umbrella term that he's using, Torahism, is not that which should define us, that we should not be included within that term because of the way he speaks of proponents of Torahism. I truly believe that guys like in the Hebrew Roots movement should be identified as under that term that he's using. So I'm just trying to make sure that we distinguish between us and them, because I truly believe that that movement really needs to be addressed, and especially on a show like Cultish, which I really like, because I do believe there's some Cultish elements to the Hebrew Roots movement, truly.
Definitely. And who knows? Maybe they'll listen. Maybe we'll get a chance to
yeah, maybe
plead our case. Maybe. All right. So we're going to start watching some clips now. Jumping forward a little bit into the interview, about 18 minutes or so. I will make all the timestamps available in the show notes for today. But yeah. So our first one that we're going to watch, where we look at Soulberg discussing the topic of the law and the gospel, their relationship. But first one we're going to look at, he sort of gives his definition and explanation of Torahism.
So just for clarity, let me define that as Torahism is the belief that the Old Covenant law is binding in its entirety on New Covenant Christians, and that not keeping all those things, meaning Sabbath and kosher food and all that, not keeping those things is to be walking in sin and disobedience. That's a broad brushstroke definition that everybody that falls under, and Hebrew Roots certainly falls under that. And
yeah, so the first thing I want to make point out is this is actually where it's going to be, we got to be careful to distinguish ourselves from Hebrew Roots, because I would actually say, yes, that is my position, that I believe that the Old Testament law, the Old Covenant law, the law contained within the Mosaic Covenant is still morally binding upon everybody in all time. Now, one thing I want to do is I want to make a point that I think Solberg reads a faulty presupposition into the text when he makes this idea, because he says that the law of the Old Covenant, or the Mosaic Covenant, it seems like he's saying that that's not the same law of the New Covenant. And that's just a faulty presupposition.
There seems to be this dichotomy of, that's the old, this is the new, and it's very, very similar language to Andy Stanley when he talks about the law as well.
Yep. And so the main point I would like to bring up is in Jeremiah 31, which is where we get the the prophecy of the new covenant most fleshed out, and then it's quoted in Hebrews 8. God says, after he says, the days are coming, I'm going to establish a new covenant. He says, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, in verse 31, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. The word for law there is Torah. It's literally the word Torah. Now, Jeremiah has spent 31 chapters condemning Israel for breaking the law of Moses, the law of God. And so to suggest that the Torah mentioned there in the prophecy is different than the law that he has just spent so much time, railing on Israel for being disobedient to, I think it's a poor reading of the context and unsupported by the text itself. I think the same law to which Jeremiah has repeatedly called Israel to return is the same law that we have in the New Covenant. He said, the problem is with you guys. The idea in the New Covenant prophecy is the problem is within you, and God speaking, he says, I'm going to fix the problem in you. The problem's not my law. The problem is your wicked hearts. And so he said, I'm going to internalize my law. And so I think that's the small, smuggled in presupposition that really makes the error come out in Solberg's position, because I truly believe that God's law is perfect. And if he's going to say that Torahism is defined by somebody who says that all of God's law is morally binding, well, that's me. But again, he will take this in different ways, and he'll start assuming that means that I believe in justification by works, which I do not. I believe that it's a sanctification issue. Do you have anything you'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, no, I think, Jeremiah 31 is such a key passage. And what I find in a lot of cases is, as they read through Jeremiah 31, they get to, I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made at Mount Sinai. Yep, and they stop there. See, it's not the same, it's different. Right. Here's this whole new brand new thing, and they fail to keep reading.
Yeah, and again, that comes back to that conflation between covenant and law. Covenant and law are not the same term. A covenant is the entire agreement, the entire, like, the stipulations, the curses, the agreement. It's kind of like a modern contract. A covenant is much more serious than a contract, but like if you write out a contract, there are deliverables, there are expectations, there are time frames, there are parties involved, there are consequences, there are prices, etc. That's the covenant. All of the stuff is the covenant, and then the law is typically essentially the deliverables or the conditions within the covenant. And so you can't conflate law and covenant. The covenant contains the law, but the covenant is not the law. And so when we say new covenant, that doesn't necessarily mean new law, because as I think I showed in Jeremiah 31, the new covenant, and I believe the Mosaic covenant is identified as the old covenant or the former covenant in the book of Hebrews and 2 Corinthians. The law is the same, though. There's an entirely new covenant, which is not like the one that he made with our fathers in the wilderness, but the law is the same between the two covenants, and God has the right to do that. And it would make sense because God's law is sourced in God's immutable character. Therefore, he can't change his law. It's got to be the same law no matter what covenant we're talking about.
Exactly right.
It's just, a lot of people are not trained specifically to understand certain terms or things like that in the Bible. And that's our fault, our pastors and our ministers' fault. Nobody's perfect, obviously, but I really believe that we need to distinguish between those two terms, covenant and law. They're not the same thing. They're not synonyms. They're not antonyms, but they're not synonyms.
Yeah. All right. Let's jump into our second clip. Solberg talking further about the relationship between law and gospel.
Finish that thought. You think of like Romans 7. The law is righteous and just and good, right? So Paul's not anti-law, but he's putting it in its proper perspective. In Galatians, what we see is that what we call the Judaizers, which would be these are folks in the first century who were Jewish, who were raised Jewish, came to believe in Jesus, and now have come to this mistaken understanding that, oh, wait a second, I think everyone needs to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses, the Jewish law, before they can follow the Jewish Messiah. And so that exact theology is what we see today in Hebrew roots. So in a sense, you could say, oh, the entire book of Galatians applies directly to Torahism or Hebrew roots.
Yeah.
Because
So I can't speak for all of Hebrew roots, but I'm sure probably there's a number of those, but definitely us in and within the Pronomian movement, we reject Judaizing. Judaizing, the belief that, okay, in order for you to participate in the new covenant promises, you need to become Jewish. And this whole understanding was built on the belief that someone needed to become Jewish before they could become part of God's covenant people. And this typically involved the proselytizing process of circumcision. And then once they're in, okay, now you need to bear the Jewish identity markers, which were established in the intertestamental period under the Seleucid reign especially. So the three key things, Sabbath, food, and circumcision, became uniquely Jewish identity markers. And so these became the signs that, okay, you're doing these things, you belong. This is how you stay in the covenant. And this is where you get into Paul's discussion of works of the law. These sectarian interpretations of the law. Okay, you satisfy this, you get to stay in. And so Paul's argument, which is our position, is we enter the covenant by faith, and we stay in because of the completed work of Christ. No other reason. And it's out of a desire to demonstrate the sincerity of our faith, a desire to demonstrate our love for God and our gratitude for what Jesus accomplished for us. That's what motivates our obedience to the law. Christ died because we disobeyed the law. Like, how can we go, oh, well, doesn't matter now? It's, the old analogy of, I got pulled over for speeding and I got a ticket. But someone paid my ticket, so I guess that means you don't have to worry about speed signs anymore. Like, it just, it doesn't add up. Josh, anything to add to Solberg's comments there on Romans 7, or?
Yeah, there's a lot that I could say there. Getting into the idea of the Jewish law, which I think is a misconception. I don't think that God's law is Jewish. I think that God's law is universal, and it's God's law. It's not Jewish law. And I don't know exactly where Solberg stands on who is supposed to obey the law, maybe if it's an ethnocentric law. But regardless, outside of that, you are 100% totally right that Pronomians do not believe that our justification is maintained or achieved by our obedience. We do not believe that that you have to satisfy conditions X, Y, and Z before you can be a member of the new covenant. That is what's called Judaizing. That is what's called legalism, and we reject that wholesale. And I stand alongside Soulberg in saying that that's a false gospel. That's Galatians 1 anathema. Anybody preaching that gospel is a false gospel. At the very end of Galatians, Paul, he says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, and that means that your justification is not based upon circumcision. That's the whole argument in the book of Galatians, is that the Judaizers are coming in and saying, hey, you actually can't be a member of the new covenant unless you first go get snipped first. And Paul has some really harsh words. He actually says at one point, I wish those who would tell you to do that would just go all the way with the knife themselves, and so he tells them to castrate themselves because it's a false gospel. We know that we are not justified by works of the law, specifically circumcision or Sabbatarianism or keeping festivals or food laws, etc. Paul says in 5:2, he says, look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, talking about this proselyte, this accepting it as a means by which you are to be a new covenant member, Christ will be of no advantage to you. He says, I testify again, every man who accepts circumcision, he's obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ. You who would be justified by the law, you have fallen from grace. Verse 4 there. So he's saying those who are using circumcision to justify themselves before God's eyes, you have fallen from grace because you're no longer depending on grace. You're depending on works of the law. So we wholeheartedly reject that idea. That is a false gospel. There's no obedience that we can commit that would mean that we're good in God's eyes. And as two Reformed folks here, we believe that salvation is monergistic. God saves and gives the gift of faith, that my salvation is not in my hands, it's in God's hands. So no work that I do can do that because it would be not depending on God's grace. So our desire to live according to God's law is not a justification issue. It's a sanctification issue. It's not what gets us into the kingdom. It's once we're in the kingdom. It's once we are members of the new covenant. How are we supposed to live as Christians? And that's where we go with God's law.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the whole concept of it's a Jewish law, and I think that's where a lot of them get sort of caught up. I don't know. I think this is something that maybe, I don't know, I'm just assuming now. It's something that Solberg inherited as a teaching, and he's taken it on, and so it's just repeating it. So I think, if we can, remove that, I guess, idea of it's Jewish. It's God's, the revelation of God's righteous and moral character is not a cultural phenomenon. It's
right.
It's
and we had to figure out also, what does he mean by Jewish? Does he mean ethnically Jewish? Does he mean religiously Jewish? Because both of which I think are problematic, because I don't believe you have to be ethnically Jewish to be a son of Abraham. That's also Paul's point in Galatians, because he says it's the children of faith who are the sons of Abraham, not the ones who come from his loins. And also religiously Jewish. Talmudic Judaism, like Christ denying Judaism, is not how you become a new covenant member. It's actually contrary to the new covenant and contrary to the gospel, because it's a false religion. And so, yes, you don't have to become Jewish, whether you mean ethnically or religiously, before you can believe in the Jewish Messiah. And just on top of that, last thing I'll say, yes, God's law is not Jewish, because God's law was in force before there was ever the first Jew, before Judah was ever born. And because the law of God is not sourced in the Jews, it's sourced in the immutable character of God himself. Murder is wrong because God cannot murder. So it's, there's a lot there, but I don't want to spend too much more time on that idea, I guess.
No. Yep. So all right, we'll move on now. So we're going to jump to the topic of, and this is a topic that's used very often when people engage the idea of the continuity of the law, and this is the idea drawn very much from Galatians, and that's the topic of law and slavery. We've got a few clips for this one, and we're just going to reply to them as we go along.
And so what you've got in Galatians is, like I said, some strong language about the law. The curse of the law, Paul calls it. He equates it to slavery. And so when you try to compare that with some of the positive things Paul's saying, you're saying, how could he call the law of God slavery?
One thing I'd like to point out, just first of all, is that the law of God is never said to be slavery. Okay, the law of God serves as a witness against us. It says that elsewhere it says that the scriptures held us like condemned, because when you look at God's law is black and white. It is binary. It is, here is the standard of perfection, and when it looks at you, it says you are either perfect or you're imperfect. There's no middle ground. It's black and white. You're either guilty or you're innocent. And so the law itself is not slavery. When you are under its condemnation, when it says that you are guilty, you're enslaved to your sin. And so and again, that's because if you're trying to be justified by your obedience, you are a slave. There is nothing, there's nothing that you can do. Galatians 5:1-4 is usually cited, and that's the passage I just read a minute ago, because it starts off, it says, for the sake of freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. And Solberg's going to say that yoke of slavery is God's law itself. But no, that's not. If you remember, it says, look, I, Paul, say to you, if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision, he's obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. He says that you have to keep the whole law, because if you're trying to be justified by your obedience, remember, I said it's black and white. It's perfection or it's guilty. It's innocence or it's guilty. And so if you're trying to be justified by your own works, then you better be perfect. But problem is, and I wouldn't say I don't know for you, but I do know for you, and I know for everybody else, we're not perfect. We come into this world born into sin, and so we can't. So again, Paul is warning against those who seek justification through the law, and that is slavery, because you're trapped in a system that you can never fulfill. You can never fulfill the righteous requirements of God's law because you're born into sin already. You're born a hostile hater of God, and you need to be redeemed of that. And Paul, he doesn't talk of, and Solberg mentions this in the video, he doesn't talk of the law of God as slavery itself. He says the law is holy and righteous and good and spiritual. That's Romans 7. And so I think that Solberg's claim just misrepresents the biblical teaching. The bondage is not God's law. It's using the law of God wrongly as a means of earning justification.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a sense as well, like, I remember seeing a meme a little while ago where it's sort of the idea of, God, he just rescued Israel from slavery in Egypt. Let me bring you to my mountain and have another layer of slavery. Like, it just... Yeah.
The very first thing God does when he liberates Israel from slavery is he gives them the law of God. And so he's not... Yeah. You're not enslaved by law, giving commandments. Like, my dad didn't make me a slave by saying, hey son, don't touch the top of the stove when it's hot because you'll burn yourself. That wasn't slavery. That was for my good.
Yeah. Let's try to find... There we go. Yeah, so in Galatians 3, and this is, I think, where Solberg and others will get the idea of law and slavery from. Mm-hmm. Now, before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed. When you actually look at the idea of being held captive, that's actually a positive term. It's like you're kept under guard, you're kept under protection. It's like the law was there to guard you and to protect people. So yes, we're held captive, but it's like a protective captivity.
Yeah, Paul uses that same word, guard or captivity, a couple other times. He uses it in 2 Corinthians 11:32. He says that at Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus. And so the idea is he's guarding it from invaders at that point. And Paul uses it also in Philippians 4:7. He says, and the peace of God is essentially a doxology. He says, the peace of God, which surpasses all understandings, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And so, and Peter uses it one time too. In 1 Peter 1:5, he says, you who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in time. It's a very positive word. Sadly, we just kind of assume it's a negative word, but the idea of the law being our guardian, he was like our pedagogue. The Greek term there is literally like pedagogos, which is like a tutor for a young child to train them and then send them off to their teacher as they come of age. And that's what the law of God does. It says, hey, this is what's perfection. This is the standard of perfection that God has, and you've not met it. You need to be conformed to it. And it points to someone else, and it says, there's the one who is perfect, and there's your hope. because
Yep.
it points to Jesus. The law of God does that. It did that. It does that, and it will do that always.
Yep. All right, let's jump to our next clip.
These things don't live by the flesh, he says. Live by the Spirit. So it's not like we're without any sort of moral guidance now that the law, so to speak, isn't binding on us anymore. We're just no longer subject to the condemnation that the law brought us. And then in that sense, the law is still very valid today to point out our sin. It's one of the things it does for us.
Right.
Okay, so man, there's
That's
so
one of
much
the
there.
points, yeah, and that's one of the points where Solberg confuses me
Yep.
a little bit, like trying to understand his position, because he spends so much time saying, the law is Jewish, the law is not for Christians, but we have a moral standard, and the law points out our sins. So it's like, well, which is it?
Yeah.
that's yeah.
Something that I
find
would love to ask him is, well, like you said, he seems to suggest up front that, well, he says we're not under the moral obligation to obey God's law anymore. He says, but we still have a moral code. Well, what is it? What is the moral code then? If it's not the law of God, what is it? And he seems to have an ethereal position there where he's like the leading of the Holy Spirit. And yes, I agree with that, but I think that me and Soulberg mean two different things by that, because to me, what I think the Bible teaches plainly is that the Holy Spirit leads you in accordance with his law. He doesn't lead you in accordance with something arbitrary. He leads you in accordance with God's law. Ezekiel 36 says, in prophesying the new covenant, God says, I will take out your heart of stone, put a new heart of flesh in you, and I'll put my spirit within you, and I will cause you, the Hebrew term there is very strong, I will cause you to walk in my ways and be careful to obey my statutes and my rules. And so I would just like to ask, like, does Solberg actually believe that the law of God defines sin? Because it doesn't sound like he thinks it does. It sounds like he says, it remains valid today to show us our sin. But what do you mean by that if in the next breath you say that the law of God doesn't accurately define sin? Let me give you an example. Let me try to flesh this out. He says it remains valid to show us our sin. Okay, but how do we determine, if not taking at a holistic unit, what defines sin? Because Soulberg would say that even though the law declares eating pork or shrimp is no longer a sin, or he would say that the law of God says that eating pork or shrimp is a sin, but it's no longer a sin. Well, that's just subjective. That's very unstable. You're saying that the law of God points out our sin, but then you say the law of God doesn't point out our sin because it identifies sin incorrectly. Now that we're on this side of Calvary and stuff, by his logic, I don't know. Does that confuse you too?
A little bit. I like you. I would love to ask him. I don't know, Soulberg, help us out, man.
Yeah. I just want to know, what is the definition of sin if it's not defined by the black and white clear teachings of the law of God? If the law of, like, I like to tell people this, if God ever at any point in his law told me that every Tuesday I had to stand on my head and eat French fries while spinning around, I would have to do that because that's the law of God. And that defines what I must do and what I must not do. And so if we take the whole, like, the law of God as a holistic unit, what it says is what it says. And when we start negotiating with that and we start casting off, well, these parts are no longer relevant, well, you don't have a definition of sin which is objective anymore. You have a subjective definition of sin. And if you're depending on people to say, well, the Holy Spirit led me into this and this, well, apparently, guys like Joseph Smith said that God led them to do this and come up with a new revelation. And so, like, you can't just depend on subjective leadings, because even God has said in the Word that there are deceiving spirits, and you have to test every spirit. And so we can't depend on a subjective thing. That's why the law of God is important, and it matters because it defines sin, and we cannot negotiate with that.
Absolutely. All right, let's jump to our last video on law and slavery.
Okay.
Christ.
Right.
And so you get this concept of, wait a second, there's no value now in Christ. And that, for me at least, I think of this in terms of, again, like biblical theology, the overarching storyline, and we have entered the new covenant. So what's happening is, and Paul's telling the Judaizers this, and I would tell modern Hebrew roots folks this, you're trying to put yourself back into slavery, if in the case of the Jews, right? Because they were once under the law and are no longer. You're trying to put yourself back under slavery, but Jesus has set you free. And so that's what I would say to modern folks who have come out of the Hebrew roots movement. Don't be tempted to go back into that slavery. It wasn't it wasn't a bad or horrible thing when it was in effect. But now, if you go back, you're turning your back on the on the very freedom that Jesus bought for you. He purchased for you on the cross.
Right.
And so,
So here we got Solberg sort of giving more definition on law and slavery, Jesus purchasing our freedom. It almost sounds like he's saying, well, Jesus purchased our freedom from having to obey the law there.
Yeah, that's exactly what he says, because he ends it by saying, if you go back, you're turning your back on the very freedom that Jesus bought for you, purchased for you on the cross. Jesus didn't die to free me from obeying God. Jesus died to free me from disobeying God. And here we have Solberg's main issue. I agree in the first couple statements there. He says, you're trying to put yourself back under slavery. If by that you mean you're trying to justify yourself by your works, that's going back into slavery. But just obeying God's law, which says do not murder, when a Christian obeys that law and says, I'm not going to murder somebody, and I'm going to go a step further, and I'm not going to hate my brother in my heart like Jesus has taught me to, that's not going back to slavery. That is just obeying God. It's actually like Jesus, again, he did not die to destroy God's law. He died to destroy my sin. And that's the main point. And again, I think there's just this error, this bondage, this slavery, this idea. It's not what we teach. I'm sure I know some Hebrew roots people do. They truly believe that you are justified by your works, and those are heretics. Those are capital H heretics. Yep. Those are Judaizing, anathema, Galatians 1 kind of heretics. So I stand in condemning them.
And they're the people who would need to hear Solberg's warning there. Absolutely.
Yes, but we can't.
Get out.
Yeah, you have to flee. But here's the thing. You cannot sacrifice God's law entirely for the sake of avoiding that heresy. There's a distinguishing you have to make. It's not the law of God, which is the problem. It's the misuse of God's law, which is the problem. Yep. I just think that Solberg just can't seem to grasp the understanding and the difference between justification and sanctification. Because yes, you're justified by grace through faith, and is not a work of your own, lest any man should boast. Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. But you have to obey God as a sanctification. Wasn't it Luther that said, we're saved by faith alone, but the faith alone that saves is never alone. Essentially, a saving faith, a legitimate faith in God, will always produce good works, because you're always going to want to obey God. That's the sanctification side. The justification side is you're saved by God's grace through the exercise of the faith that he gives you. And then step 2 is now you're going to be sanctified by obeying God's law. And here's the thing too, and to kind of tie that back to that last clip, I think this inconsistency on Solberg's part leads to the degradation of the Christian life. Because, hear me out, if he claims that you're freed from the law of God, yet he still insists that the law functions to reveal sin, then we have a contradictory worldview. You can't be freed from something and then still have it define sin. And you can't be freed from something and then have it partly define sin. It has to be understood holistically. You can read through the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that takes God's law and distinguishes it between certain categories. It's always seen as a holistic unit. Read Psalm 119. Read Psalm 19.
Yes.
It's all one holistic unit. Yeah, Psalm 1. It's all one. It's the law of God, because it's perfect. As Paul says, it's holy and righteous and good, and the commandment is perfect. Because God wrote it. We would have to say it. You can't say it's anything but perfect. And so Christ let me just finish out by saying Christ did not set us free to live lawlessly. He set me free from my sin so that I can now live in obedience from a transformed heart that he gave me. And I can say, as Paul says, in my new faith, do I then overthrow God's law? On the contrary, I uphold it. Romans 3:31. I want to obey God because I love God, because God has saved me despite my disobedience.
Absolutely. So I mentioned earlier that you wrote on Torahism for the Pronomian collab book that's coming out. As you sort of went through his book on Torahism, was this concept of Torahism is justification by works? Is that something that sort of he argues very strongly?
The problem is, and that's why I wanted to do this video too, is Soulberg, he really truly contradicts himself in some places. He will, like in some parts of the book, he will say that Torahists are those who seek justification by their works, and so he'll identify them as like an anathema of Galatians 1, a false gospel. But then he'll say in the same book, like on the next page, he says, I won't be surprised to see Torahists in the kingdom of heaven after the resurrection. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, bro. Did you just say that they're anathema, but you're going to see them in heaven? I really think he has, because this view is incorrect, I think there's inconsistencies in it. And so he really leans into that idea that his main concern is that people are trying to justify themselves by works of the law. And I condemn that too. Again, we've said it a million times. Yep. I condemn that. And it doesn't seem like he's very concerned. I even heard on an interview with him, I think the other day, where he said that a lady said she came out of the Hebrew roots movement and she just can't force herself to eat a pork chop anymore. Even though she believes it's okay. And Solberg said that his advice to her was follow your conscience. Well, clearly that means that Solberg seems to suggest that he's okay with people obeying the law of God out of a mere conscience, but not for justification. So I truly think his main contention is the false gospel of justification, but he confuses the terms throughout the book. And for those wondering, in this book of essays that me and Ryan, this RL, not the other RL, contributed to, it's a book of essays defending Pronomianism. And my essay was that I had to rebut the entire book that Solberg wrote called Torahism. And so I did it in about 15,000 words. It was a really tough project,
Yeah.
but I point out those kind of consistencies. And I'll have a link or I'm sure, Ryan, you'll put a link in the description to that book. It's in publication right now. It's not out yet, but when it comes out, I hope you can see that I wrestle with that. And I really take time more beyond what we can do on a quick video of showing you the inconsistencies of that view.
Yeah, I look forward to reading that essay. I mean, that to respond to a book in that many words, man. I just to you, sir.
Thanks.
Well done. All right, next one. This next topic that Solberg talks about is about typology, and I love this topic. And he uses this, and it's again another common argument against the continuity when we get into the ceremonial laws and the festivals, etc. So yeah, got a couple of clips for this one. Sorry to introduce this clip. So one of the hosts of Cultish, Andrew, he poses the question to Solberg: do people in the Hebrew roots are they missing Jesus in the feasts if they think that they need to do the feast to be holy? We should probably respond to some of the presumptions in that question there. But we'll play the clip and then we'll come back. Where are we? Clip 6.
Sheer amount, it's just this rich typology and patterns and things that are found in Christ. And Easter's a great example of that. Not only Passover, but the Feast of First Fruits, right? That I think what happens, and to me this is the biggest danger of Torahism as a whole, this kind of umbrella term, is that what it does is it slowly and insidiously draws your focus off of Christ and his work and points it back to Moses and his, the law that he gave. Sheer.
All right, so yeah, as I say, I love the typology in the Old Testament, or the First Testament, the Tanakh. I love it. I think it's amazing. And I especially love the way that the feasts, how they point to Christ, how they foreshadow and reveal his work in the incarnation, what's setting up the last days, however you want to define that. I did an episode a while ago about that. But this is where I get a little bit confused, like drawing your focus of Christ back onto Moses. If you are observing the feast with this typology in mind, if you are observing Passover, First Fruits, Sukkot, etc., if you're doing that with the understanding and the focus that Christ is the fulfillment of them. So a lot of when I do Passover with my family, it's, okay, yes, this is where it started, but I spend three quarters of the Passover meal talking about this is how this teaches us about Christ. So if we are celebrating these things with our focus on Christ as the fulfillment of these feasts, I don't know how you can turn away from Jesus in doing that. Like, would you anything to add there, Josh?
I think this is another one of those happy inconsistencies that Solberg just has. He mentions, I mean, he straight up says that the festivals are pointers to Jesus. He says that they point to Jesus, and he says that their typology looks towards him. And I agree. I believe that everything in the law of God, I mean, Jesus says, if you believed Moses, you would believe me because Moses wrote of me. And so I don't understand how he can even mention like Easter and say, yeah, when we keep Easter and we look towards Jesus by observing Easter, that he would say, well, you can't observe Passover because you won't be looking to Jesus. You'll be looking to Moses. Like, well, first of all, I am wearing my feast shirt. We talked about this at Sabbath school this past week because I truly believe that the festivals point to Jesus in all aspects. And so, but when I celebrate the feast, I don't think about Moses. I don't worship Moses. I don't, and I don't think anybody ever has. Maybe some really fringe Jews throughout the history maybe have, but the idea is that all of them point to Jesus and his work, whether it's past work or coming work. And I just think it's a ridiculous statement to say that somebody is looking away from Jesus. If Solberg will admit the feast all point to Jesus, you shouldn't observe them because they point to Jesus, and then you will be likely to not look to Jesus. It makes no sense to me whatsoever,
Yeah.
And so one thing that people like to pull up is Colossians 2:16, and I look on your shelf behind you, and I can see the book that you wrote on this passage. Yep, right there. Let no one judge you.
Yep.
Pronomian Pocket Guide to Colossians 2:16 or 16, 17, something like that. But
it's most of chapter 2. Yeah,
that's right. It's a wonderful book. You guys should get it. We'll put a link in the description too. In Colossians 2, you point out that the language really shows that it's about Jesus. Can you flesh that out for us a little bit, RL?
Yeah, so talking about Colossians 2, I'll tell you, I might play the next clip.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll play the next clip, and then that would probably be a good point to talk about.
Okay, sure.
Colossians 2.
At the Last Supper, which was a Passover Seder, Jesus didn't say we're remembering and commemorating our father's escape out of Egypt when God saved us with a mighty arm and gave us that original Passover, right? Jesus said, hey, this Passover bread, it's my body. And this Passover wine is my blood. So he reoriented everything towards himself, which, as we know, as he taught like in Luke 24, he says, the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms all pointed to me. And so when you miss that, it's like you're going back to, as Paul calls it, the shadows. You're going back to following the shadows instead of the substance that's here now. And that's, to me, that's terribly frustrating. And it's where a lot.
Yeah, so this, the language that Solberg uses there about the idea of shadows and substance is the core of what's used in Colossians 2 to say that there is no continuity in the feasts with the ceremonial law. But what I find really interesting is that when we look in scripture and even a lot of our traditions, they're full of looking forward and looking back. And just because the meaning has come, it doesn't mean that we ditch the shadow, as he talked about. Because, like, communion, the Lord's Supper, some people, I guess there's some might interpret a little bit differently, but do we abandon that then? The wine and bread at the Last Supper, that was before the formal inauguration of the new covenant. That was given to Jews. It was a shadow, and then the substance came. So bread and wine, the shadow, Jesus on the cross dying, his blood shed, substance. The substance came. Do we now? Oh well, the substance came. Let's ditch the bread and the wine or juice or however you want to describe that, because the cross has come. But it's just a little bit inconsistent. But we keep doing it to remember. We look back. Okay, yes, shadow, substance. Let's keep remembering the substance through the shadow, and because of the fullness of what the blood of Christ achieved, that fullness hasn't been realized either. So coming back to Colossians 2, what's interesting is when you actually look at the language, it says these are present tense, so these are now in the present moment a shadow of the things still to come. The substance is coming, the fullness is coming. It hasn't come yet, so the fullness isn't here yet. There's a very, I don't know, a bit of a classic analogy of, someone's at the airport, they're waiting for someone to arrive, and the plane's landed, but this person is so consumed with the shadow of the plane on the tarmac that they're ignoring the passenger on the plane. They're ignoring that the plane's even landed. It's just this shadow that they're so consumed with. The problem with the analogy is that when we look at this description in Colossians 2, the plane hasn't landed yet. It's still on the way down. And so the best thing we can do is be in the shadow of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the fullness isn't here yet. And even when the feasts were originally given, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that was all about their escape from Egypt. The substance came. They left Egypt, but they kept doing it to look back and to remember. So when we celebrate the feast with this Christ focused reorientation, as he said, like Jesus reorientated everything around him. Yes, amen.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. It's amazing. That discussion in Luke 24 on the road to, I wish I was there. I would love to hear what Jesus said about it. It would be amazing. Something to ask. With that reorientation, we have a meaningful way provided in Scripture to remember what he's done, to anticipate and learn about what he's going to do. So what he's done with the spring feast, the Passover, unleavened bread and first fruits, and then the fall feasts pointing to the last days. And so we celebrate those with anticipation. We are still awaiting the full substance. Do you think that this change in tense makes much difference, do you think, in how we read it?
Yeah. So I agree with everything you say there. One thing that I'd like to point out is I think you make a great point with saying communion, and whether or not, some people place communion as the night before Passover. Some people place it as Passover itself. Solberg seems to say it was on Passover night itself. But either way, that would have been a pre-Calvary institution. And so if the ceremonial stuff pre-Calvary, during the quote unquote Old Covenant time, dissolved.
The Jews?
Yeah, dissolved. They're all Jews. Dissolved with the inauguration of the New Covenant. Well, then you would have to make that consistently and say, well, baptism and the Lord's Supper are now. Well, maybe not baptism because that's after the resurrection. But either way, it seems like there would be an issue there that why would you even take communion if that's a ceremony thing before Calvary? But but I don't take that view at all. I think that it's instituted. It's part of God's law to do that. And one thing I'd like to point out, and I'll show it on the screen here for those watching, the tensing in Colossians 2, 16 and 17 is so intentional, because if you look, it says these in verse 17, these, which is talking about food and drink, festival, new moon, and Sabbath. These is plural. It says, and they are now. So are, that's a present tense verb. So these are a shadow, which is singular, of the things to come. And so actually the idea there of the things still to come, that's a present active participle. And so that means they are things coming. The coming of these things has already begun, and it's presently happening right now. And so food and drink, the festivals, new moons, and the Sabbath are actively, in Paul's time when he writes this to the church in Colossae, they are actively a single shadow of the things presently coming. And that singular shadow unit is being cast by Christ. It says the substance or the body, its soma, belongs to Christ. So the thing that's casting the shadow is Jesus. And so what I like to point out to people is, like you just said, the closer you are in the shadow of something, necessarily by proximity, the closer you are to the thing that cast it. We read into this passage a couple of presuppositions. A lot of people first assume that Paul is telling the Colossians, hey, don't let people judge you for not obeying these or not keeping these. They assume that the Colossians are not keeping them because that's just what they're being told. But if you don't make that faulty assumption, you read this passage in a whole new light. Read it with the assumption that they are keeping it. And Paul says, let no one pass judgment on you. And he goes on and he says in verse 18, asceticism, worship of angels. Obviously, the people in Colossae are keeping the festivals, and other people are coming in, maybe former pagans, trying to syncretize their paganism with their new Christianity. It says we need to add these elements of angel worship into these festivals that you guys are observing. And number two, we assume that shadows are negative. Shadows are not negative. Shadows are actually the closest thing you can get to being the real caster. Solberg makes a point in the video, and we didn't play this part, but he mentions a boy who's waiting for his dad to come home, and he has a picture of his dad, and he loves the picture of his dad. And then the dad finally comes home, and the boy's like, "No, Dad, I don't want to talk to you. I'm interested in this photo." And so he disregards the caster for the sake of the shadow. Now that is ridiculous. I think that yes, if you are observing something, the shadow, without actually wanting the caster, yeah, that's a problem. But I don't think that's what Paul's arguing here. And so, but by that same logic, that means I don't need to have photos of anything in my life, or pictures, or memories, or videos, because I already have the reality. But that's silly. My dad lives next door. I love my father. He's a wonderful, godly man, and I still have photos of him on my wall. Same thing with my wife and my child. I can hear him running through the house right now, but I have photos of him on my computer, on my background, on my walls, etc. And those are they're connected, but the caster is greater, but the shadow points directly to the caster. And so it's like assuming a blank wall with no shadow on it versus a wall with my son's picture. Which one is going to connect me more to my son? It's the one with a photo of my son on it. So we just have to, all the tenses and everything in that passage show us that the closer you are in the shadow of a thing casting the shadow, the closer you are to the thing casting the shadow. And so I want to be in the shadow. I want to be under the shadow of my God's wings. I want to do what points to him, you know? So yeah, go ahead.
Those Psalms coming out, Josh.
Yeah. Well, you can tell I've been preaching through the Psalms.
Yeah. Alright, so that's festivals and shadows. When I look now at the case of Peter, the case of Peter in Galatians 2, something I talked about in Forgotten Covenant, that one. Soulberg, when talking about it, makes this interesting point that I want to discuss.
And so what happens is he says Peter has been eating with the Gentiles. Great, we're all one big united happy family. But he says Peter had pulled away from the Gentiles when the Judaizers came, when some men from James from Jerusalem came, right, and started teaching them, wait a second, they need to be circumcised, they need to keep the law of Moses, etc. So it says that Peter was kind of shrunk away. He was afraid of them, and he stopped eating with the Gentiles. He broke fellowship with them. Paul doesn't say it outright, but the assumption there would be because of the food laws, right? The unclean food. And so Paul doesn't just say that was dumb. He says you are not in line with the truth of the gospel.
Yeah. From Galatians 2, it's very common, I think, that people attach these ideas of food laws to Galatians 2 and what's happening. Well, the reason Peter withdrew is because of the food laws. Gentiles are not eating kosher. So that's the idea of what's going on. And I think maybe, for some, the reason that they do that is to help support common interpretations of Acts 10, which is about the ending of the food laws. It's sort of used there to go, well, Acts 10, Gentiles, food laws were abolished. Well, Galatians 2, well, that must be the same thing that's happening there. What are your thoughts on that connection there, Josh?
Yeah, so I don't believe that that's the annulment of anything of God's law, whether it be food or whatever. I think that is when Peter is acting hypocritically. Okay, so a little bit of context in the background. First century Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, like pre-Talmudic Judaism, traditional Judaism, it was very hostile to non-Jews in terms of you were not allowed to eat with certain people. You couldn't go in the same house with a Gentile. You definitely could not share a meal with a Gentile because you would become unclean, or you'd become, technically they would say you become common, okay, which is a fabricated category that the Bible does not have. There's clean and unclean, not common. It's a middle category. That's not in the Bible. And so in Galatians 2, Paul rebukes Peter and calls him out because he's, as he says in verse 14, he's not in step with the truth of the gospel. And so he called him out. this was after so many years, and Paul still had no problem calling out a brother because Peter's acting hypocritically. He's eating with Gentiles, and then when some people come in from James, Jewish Christians come in, he stops eating with Gentiles because he's still holding on to this, honestly, this like prejudiced kind of view of non-Jewish Christians, and so he didn't want to eat with them. And that is exactly, and I truly believe that's exactly the problem that God is solving in Acts chapter 10 with Peter's vision. Peter never is told by God to not call something unclean. I'll just read it real fast. It says in verse 13, the sheet comes down, there's all kinds of animals, there's clean animals, there's unclean animals on the same sheet. And in verse 13, and there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." So you've got two words there, akatharos and koinos. And so he said, and the voice came to him a second time, "What God has made clean, don't call common." And this happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. And then Peter is perplexed as to what it means. The main point here is, what does God say in verse 15? What God has made clean, don't call common. Do you see that God only corrects Peter's view of something that is common, not unclean? God does not say, what God has made clean, don't call unclean. God never corrects Peter's understanding of unclean meats. He corrects Peter's anti-biblical traditional view of common meats. So what's happening in that vision is that Peter sees like a cow and a pig. And a Jew would say, the cow is clean by God's law, the pig is unclean by God's law. There's your 2 categories. But a cow that is hanging out with a pig becomes common. And so there's a 3rd category they've created. And they said you can't eat the common cow. Even though it's a clean animal, you can't eat it now because it's common. And that's what the Jews of the first century extended that to people. They said if a Jew, a clean man, hangs out with a Gentile, an unclean man, the Jew becomes common. That is like prejudice. That's racist. Honestly, just call it what it is. And God is correcting that within Peter. He says, don't not eat with a Gentile because you think they're common. He says, what God has made clean, don't call common. There's no such thing as an unclean person. And so there's no such thing as a common person because you can't have proximity to an unclean person if there's no unclean persons to become common. That's the main issue. And Peter still 14 years later, as Paul says in Galatians, 14 years later is dealing with that. He's not eating with Gentile Christians, even though he says we're in the same new covenant. I can't eat with you because I'll become dirty. I'll become common. And so Paul has to rebuke him. And so, without that background, you don't know what's going on. Essentially, uncircumcised Christians, Gentiles who become Christians who weren't circumcised on the 8th day because they had no idea what that commandment was because they weren't raised in a religion that obeyed God's law. They're still Christians. But they're still Christians, and so you can't not eat with them. It's all about Jewish exclusivism, and Peter was giving into peer pressure. That's the main point, and he was being a hypocrite, and Paul, he called him out on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely it was post Acts 10. I know there's some debates, but it says Peter's been fine with it before, but now he's giving into peer pressure. That whole background about Jewish exclusivism and supremacy, views of the Gentiles. I think that's a cultural thing that gets lost. It's something that I'm looking at, starting to work on, do some research on to help understand how does this Jewish perception towards Gentiles, how does that shape the New Testament, and how can that help us understand it? So that's a project. Starting to work on.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I think you want to go on to the last clip. I think we're here at the end.
Yep. All right. So we're going to finish off with talking about the law and the law that we follow, and Solberg sets up this contrast between the law of Christ and the law of Moses. So
Guilty about it, follow your conscience, but at the same time understand we are under the new covenant and the law of Christ, as Paul called it in Galatians 6. We're not under the law of Moses anymore.
Absolutely. No.
Yep.
So here we have the idea that the law of Christ and the law of Moses are 2 different things. And I don't know, it just feels like is it a kind of will for ignorance or the playing out of a cognitive dissonance? Because who gave Moses the law?
My Bible says that Jesus gave Moses the law. In Jude 5, it says that Jesus once saved a people out of the land of Egypt, and then afterward destroyed those who wouldn't believe. And Jesus is the God who led the people out of Egypt. And then what did we say earlier? He gives them the law right after that.
Yeah, that's the law of Christ. There we go. Done.
Yeah, so I'd like to bring up that point because in Galatians 6:2, you know, this whole conversation Solberg is kind of basing on the book of Galatians, which, by the way, if you're curious, I preached through the entire book of Galatians last year at Logos, so all of my sermons will be available for that. You can read them in manuscript form or you can watch them because I wanted to correct the misunderstandings that guys like Solberg have about this book because it's not a nail in the coffin against us as Pronomians. I promise it's not. And so, but he'll go, the law of Christ is essentially only found here in Galatians 6:2. Paul says, if anyone is caught in a transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness and keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Now, there's a whole sermon right there. You got to get in the pit with your brother who's lost and make sure you guard yourself because you're helping him pull out. But in verse 2, he says, so bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And so the law of Christ is mentioned here. Now, the thing we need to make note of is Solberg is saying, well, this law is a different law in the new covenant. Remember, it goes back to the first thing I think I said, which is that the law of God is the same law within the Mosaic covenant as it is in the new covenant. But Solberg is like, no, that old law is for that old covenant, and there's a new law, and he calls it the law of Christ in the new covenant. But here's the thing. Paul has already mentioned one time in Galatians this law of Christ, and look what he says in 5:14. It says the whole law is fulfilled in one word. And he quotes from Leviticus 19:18, you shall love the Lord, or you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, here's the thing. Is Paul speaking about two different laws? Or is he speaking about one law in Galatians 5 and Galatians 16? Remember, there's no chapter divisions in the original manuscripts. It's just a letter. He says the whole law is fulfilled in this. And he quotes from the law of Moses. And then he says, and think about that. Loving your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, you are to bear one another's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ. He just called Leviticus 19:18 the law of Christ. It's the same thing. It's the same law. You know?
Yeah. And that was Jesus' point as well. When someone came and asked him, what's the greatest commandment?
Yep.
Love God and love your neighbor as yourself.
Yep. So this idea, it's also mentioned one other time in 1 Corinthians 9. I think it's verse 12.
21.
No, 21. Yeah, I'm dyslexic. Sorry. Thank you. So it's mentioned one other time, the law of Christ. And Paul says to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. And he puts in parentheses, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. So he equates the law of God with the law of Christ right here. I don't think there's any other way you can get around that. Not outside the law of Christ, but under the law, or not outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ. And so to say it's a different law, first of all, is to pit God and Jesus against each other. And we're Trinitarian. We're good Trinitarians. We know that Jesus is God. Therefore, you can't pit them against each other. God the Father didn't have a special law, and then God the Son didn't come to give a new special law. What happened, and I think this is just Bible 101, we really got to get back to the foundation. This idea that the law of Christ replaces the law of Moses is just completely novel. Jesus came as God himself to teach and guide the people into the proper understanding of the law of God. Whether you want to call it the law of God, the law of Moses, the law of Christ, it's the same thing. Because Jesus is the lawgiver. It's not a new law. The law of Christ is the law of Moses fulfilled, clarified, and applied by Jesus Christ for all new covenant believers. It's not a different thing.
And that comes back to Matthew 5, when Jesus came to fulfill the law. And to fulfill the law in rabbinic literature, I believe, describes someone who takes the law and teaches it accurately and upholds it faithfully, saying, follow the law, this is what the law means, this is how you do it. That is fulfilling the law in a pedagogical sense.
Yep.
And that's what Christ did through the whole Sermon on the Mount. And so often, and I was talking with someone just not that long ago, saying that, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus took the law and made it harder. Or, he reinterpreted it. yeah, yeah, it's people seem to overlook the fact that Jesus rightly interpreted it. He took all the traditions and the layers and the boundaries that the Pharisees had put around the law and stripped them away and said, this is how you do it. I did an episode last year with David and a follow-up episode as well on this topic. But yeah, it's this idea of law of Christ as Christ's interpretation of the law. That's sort of something I've heard a bit as well.
Yeah. Jesus is, he's three things in terms of the law. He's the lawgiver. He's the law explainer. So the giver at Sinai, he's the law explainer on the Sermon on the Mount in the Incarnation, and he's the law fulfiller at Calvary.
Yep.
He does all three. He gives it, he explains it, he fulfills it. And that's exactly what God promises. One of the texts I'm just going to mention one time, and it's the other text in the prophets about the new covenant, it's Ezekiel 36. I love this passage. I use it as an assurance of pardon for my church a lot of times. God says, I will sprinkle clean water on you, verse 25, and you shall be clean from all your uncleannesses, and from your idols I'll cleanse you, and I'll give you a new heart, and a new spirit I'll put within you, and I'll remove the heart of stone from your flesh, and give you a heart of flesh, and I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and be careful to obey my rules. Okay, so that's what is promised in the new covenant. God says, I'm going to cause you to walk in my statutes, and be careful to obey my rules. Those are not new statutes and rules. I know I've said that before, but Jeremiah and Ezekiel are talking about the same law of God that they've been talking about the whole time in their prophecies. The law of God now becomes internalized in the new covenant. We now have it within us. It's not just outside in our Bibles anymore. It's in us because the Holy Spirit who wrote it is leading us into obedience to it. So the law of God is simply the law of God. The law of Christ is the law of God explained by Christ, fulfilled by Christ, given by Christ, and now we walk in newness of life with it. Not to be justified, but in our sanctification.
Yeah, absolutely. I love those passages.
Yeah.
So powerful just seeing God at work in restoring humanity. And that's the salvation story of not just, okay, they've sinned, I need to find a way to forgive these people and redeem them so they can, have a part in my world to come, but he's actually involved in transforming, restoring our moral character and who we are inside to be people who walk in step with his ways. And as it is sort of given in the Mosaic covenant, okay, here's some rules written on stone, do those things. No spirit, no empowerment, just do them. I believe the empowerment was existent in that time, but the whole point of the new covenant is having these sort of rules external to you. It's not working. They're falling short. So I'm going to make these laws part of them. I'm going to write it on their hearts. And that comes into circumcising their hearts as well to transform them. It's sort of like, again, if this is God's law, he's going to make it a part of us. So instead of attaching that to a covenant document, he's going, okay, that is now a part of you. He
solves the problem, and the problem is not his law. The problem is our wicked, stony, God-hating hearts. And so he solves that problem. He puts the law of God on our hearts, and now it's internalized. And now we, by the Spirit, like you said, can walk in empowerment and in conformance with God's law. Not to be justified, but because we're justified.
Yeah, exactly right. And as Solberg sort of mentioned in the interview, I don't know if it got picked up in any of the clips, but he talks about being, a biblical theologian, like tracking the story of the Bible. Well, that's the story of the Bible, part of God's restoration of humanity. We've walked away from following God, and that's the natural progression there. Yep. Yeah. So I guess to sort of wrap it up, to sort of tie it all together.
Okay.
With Soulberg, I'm sure you agree, or you have said it. With Soulberg, we affirm that if you're working for your salvation, if you believe, well, I've got to do these things in order for God to accept me, then you're walking the wrong path. You've bought into a false gospel. Christ alone, faith alone in what he's done, because of God's grace alone, that is how you get right with God. That is how you get forgiven. That is how you get reconciled with your Creator. And that's how you move forward into the newness of the new creation that he has for you. So with Soulberg, if people are selling themselves short of salvation. Like, it's not just this small doctrinal thing; it has big implications. The whole concept of, well, what does that law look like? On the one hand, it gets a bit dicey, but I see it as a secondary matter. I'm happy to call Solberg my brother. I think there's a lot I could learn from him. It's just this one area. So I guess sort of in wrapping up as well, I want to help sort of reframe that. I'm not going to throw out everything he does and says because we agree on this area. Now, this area of theology is, 95% of Solberg's ministry.
Yeah.
But I just, I know for me and I know for you as well, Josh, we just wanted the opportunity to respond to a lot of these claims or these descriptions that Solberg has made and say, help us understand, because in places you seem to contradict yourself, in other places we feel like, well, you would label us as Torahists, but we're not working for our salvation.
Right. Yeah, it all comes down
Josh?
to that. If and I agree with you. I think that a differing view on God's law does not put you outside the camp of Christianity. I think that a lot of this is very practical. It's tier 2, what I consider tier 2. It'd make you hard to be in the same church with each other, but it wouldn't put you outside of the same religion as each other. So it's not a gospel issue. I think full-fledged antinomianism would be, because that's denying that there's any sin at all anyway. But this is not. This is an in-house debate, and I truly think that, and I hope that he thinks that the same. Because we're not trying to be justified by our obedience. If you are trying to be, like as RL Watson just said, if you are trying to be justified in God's eyes by what you do, that is a false gospel. And we honestly and sincerely ask you and beg you to repent of that and to embrace the true gospel, which is that you are saved by God's grace through your faith alone, and that your salvation is secure. And then from that security, now you walk in newness of life in conformity to God's law. But God's law can't save you. God's law can do one thing, and that is render you either innocent or guilty. And in the case of every single human being, with the exception of the Lord Jesus Christ, we are guilty because we've broken it. Yeah. So, yeah, and I would like to stand alongside guys like Soulberg in defending the true gospel, and we are going to disagree on this, but hey, brothers disagree. So to wrap all that up, I would just like to make sure that we mention again, there is a book coming out. It's called Pronomianism, Essays on Defending Pronomianism, essentially. And my chapter is a response, a rebuttal to Solberg's entire book, Torahism. Ryan, you wrote a chapter on the book. Would you like to tell people what you wrote about?
Yeah, so my chapter was all about food laws for the New Covenant community. So I go through Leviticus 11, just unpacking it. What are the food laws? What do they look like? Sort of doing a little bit of myth busting, if you will, challenging some presumptions that people have. For example, eating unclean food made you unclean, and that's why Jesus came. I sort of touch into that. Yeah. I walk through Mark 7, and a case where Jews were concerned about having common hands because they were out in the marketplace with Gentiles, and they got the Gentile cooties now. How do we understand that passage exegetically? Touching a little bit on Acts 10. So, yeah, a lot of the stuff, some of the stuff we talked about today with Peter and Acts 10, I get into that as well. Yeah.
And if you would like to learn more, guys, all of our resources can be found at pronomian.org. It's kind of like a landing site for everything Pronomian. So if you'd like to learn more about what we believe as Pronomians, you can read books there. You can see our events. You can find churches that are in the Pronomian movement, etc. So if you would like to do that, please feel free to move over onto pronomian.org. Stay connected with us. And I just want to say it's been a great time to be with you, Ryan, and I'm really glad that we had a chance to talk about this. I don't know if there's nothing else that I can think of, so I just appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I appreciate your time as well. The few obstacles we had to overcome, but we got there, and I just feel blessed having this conversation with you, Josh. So, listeners, thank you so much for tuning in, listening. I hope this conversation's been a blessing. If it has blessed you, please share it. Share it with someone who you think will be blessed by it as well. So, not sure exactly when I'll be back with my regular podcast episodes. Planning around about September, but tune in. Be on the lookout for other random bonus episodes on the way. So, Josh, again, thanks for joining us, and thank you for listening. God bless.
God bless.
Free